Welcome to Lean RPA Principles and Practice. Today is Chapter 8, Developing Your First Automation by Rob King. In previous chapters, we've looked at why there is a need for Lean and RPA. We've looked at some of the frameworks that can help you to get started and structure your program of work, including running a pilot. And we've looked in detail at some of the lean principles that can help you evaluate existing processes, identify the right processes to automate, and also optimize those processes before you begin development. Now we're going to look more closely at the technology. If you've never developed in automation before, then this chapter will introduce 3 different products and how they approach automation, and you'll see some simple automations developed. If you're an existing automation developer, then you're not going to see particularly anything challenging in terms of the automations we develop, but you will see 3 different tools that have been selected deliberately to demonstrate the different approaches that are available to driving automation and some of the pros and cons of each one. If you're looking at this from more of an operational or strategic perspective, then it gives an opportunity to sort of see some of the challenges, difficulties, pros and cons of using the different tools. In this chapter, we're going to start by looking at how Windows applications work. That's Windows applications or browser-based applications. Understanding how these applications work will help you to understand what you need to do to develop automations. We're then going to look at how automations work, understanding how they interact with those underlying physical systems. This is going to introduce us to the topic of selectors, which is what distinguishes modern day automation from perhaps the screen scraping you may have heard of from the past, and what difference this makes. We're going to look at 3 completely different technologies and see how they approach each of these different layers of automation. And finally, we're going to put it all together and relate it back to some of the lessons we learned, particularly from value stream mapping and process mapping in the previous chapters. Now, this chapter also comes with a small warning. The examples that we're going to look at today, just through the constraints of time and not boring you to tears with long, complicated scenarios, are deliberately quite simple examples. But don't get fooled. Both these technologies will scale up and will actually allow you to do far more complex type tasks. However, also doing those more complex type tasks will take time and does need the required governance and controls to make sure that you do them in a structured manner. So simple is normally good, but please bear in mind these are just small examples in a more complex environment. What we have on the screen here is an example of a typical Windows application. You can see at the top of the screen it's called the Training CRM. It's got a menu with 2 options, New and Window, and a number of tabs underneath. Within those tabs, there are a number of different fields of varying types. Some of those fields are for data entry, like the account name, and some of them are radio buttons, such as the New Pending. There are also push buttons, like the New and Remove, and there's a data grid at the bottom that represents lots of data items in a grid. And when you interact with this application and you move from field to field and tab from field to field, it's quite a natural input screen, and you've been used to it through many applications. But what's going on behind the scenes? Well, there are 3 principles that we'd like to introduce, that if you're not familiar with Windows, then this is important when it comes to developing your automation applications. Those 3 things are properties, events, and functions. And I'll start with properties. Properties are items within the Windows application that you can either read from or assign values to. And they tell you about the status of the current window, field, or item that you're looking at. So for example, in a Windows application, a typical property might be one called visible. If visible is set to true, then you'll be able to see it on the screen. And if you were to assign a value of false to that property, then it would disappear from the screen. And there are a number of different properties that vary from application to application that you will have access to. And when you're developing an automation, you'll be able to see the different properties that are available. In a typical Windows application, there are some properties which you will see time and time again. And these are the examples that we've got in the properties box at the top right of the screen. Properties can contain different types of values. So the visible one we discussed earlier can only really hold the values of true or false. But other properties might contain text fields like values, like the name, for example. As you're developing your automation, inevitably you're going to want to understand what the current state of the screen is and read values from that screen. Or, as you're developing your automation, you may want to assign values back. So some of the typical properties then are enabled. Enabled means that the field or object is available for the user to interact with. An enabled object can respond to the user, where an enabled set to false would prevent that. Exist is a property, again true or false, that tells you whether something exists yet. If you're waiting for a window to open, for example, you're waiting for that window to exist. Focused is a property which tells you where you're focused on the screen. The text is an object within a field to give different types of information. Within a text field, for example, an account name, it would tell you the data nice in this example, and on the status field, it would tell you new. And visible, as we've talked about before, lets you know if the user can see the information. So properties are like variables, which we'll also discuss in a future slide, that contain values about the window that you're looking at. Events are slightly different. Events change things in Windows because events can happen in different orders. The user can click on different fields at any time, generating events around that field to say the user's now here. So this time you start to sort of see events being things like gained focus because the user has moved into a specific field, or lost focus because the user has moved out of a field. A mouse has clicked on a button, for example, or double clicked to show that you've actually sort of interacted with different components. Events can be triggered at any time in any order. So this provides us with the facility to react to what's happening on the screen. And we can link in to events and do certain actions at the point that those events are triggered. So on desktop automation, for example, if every time the user clicks on a new account button, we want to go away and start to copy that data to lots of other systems, we can sit there waiting for that new account event to happen, and when it does, the automation will kick in. So, events allow us to react to things that are happening. Functions then are the other way around. This allows us to trigger an action and do something. So as after an event has triggered, for example, or as a workflow that's running as part of your automation, you can call upon these functions to do certain things within the application. Some functions are common to almost all types of application, such as click, which allows you to simulate the click of a button. Other things, for example, like refresh, often refresh the screen to allow you to sort of see the current update. And set focus allows you to set the focus with the user on a specific field. If you wanted to position the user in, say, the street box, you could set the focus to that box. So that, again, there are a number of different applications that will have functions within them that you can call upon to use when you're doing your own automations. Properties, events and functions will be something you'll become more and more familiar with the more you develop your own automation. Here's another example. This time we're looking at a browser-based application. Again, you can see a number of different properties, but on this time the properties have changed. Each application has its own properties that you can utilize, and understanding how the application works will help you understand what some of these properties may do. Of course, you can always revert to Google if you're not sure. Here we can see many of the properties similar to the last application, but we've gained one like called style, which again gives us more information about the presentation layer within the application. Some applications will allow you finer control than others, providing you with application events such as a field has changed. So if a user updates the contents of a field, again, you can piggyback on the back of that and do some processing, knowing that some value has changed within the application. And when it comes to triggers or functions, again, we can interact with the application just like a user can, clicking in fields, clicking on buttons, and selecting options. Two concepts which are useful to know about before you embark on developing your first automation are variables and functions. There's lots more information you can find out about this online, but just very simply, thinking about variables, imagine a series of boxes. Each of those boxes has a name, and each of those boxes has a contents. So the box called user has the contents called Rob. Now there's a few analogies here as with referencing to variables. So each of the box names are the variable names, and the contents of the box is the value that's actually used when you reference that variable. So for example, if you were to sort of print out a message, hello Rob, you could print out a message saying hello user, and on the screen it would actually just show the contents. It would actually say hello Rob. Now variables are useful to us because it allows information to change over time, increment, decrement, as to do maths on those functions, and to make decisions based on the values in those boxes. Variables also can be given different types of information. So we've looked at true and false previously when we considered properties. We can give it only numeric information, as in the total, or we can give it alphanumeric information, as in the user. Or we can be more specific, and we can give it currency type information, such as £3.60, so it knows there needs to be 2 decimal places. Variables help us reference information as we develop our automations and become a very powerful tool in our toolkit. Second concept that we need to consider when we start developing automations is functions. Functions are simply small pieces of automation code that can perform a specific function. By putting functions together and giving them meaningful names makes our applications more readable. So we can understand when we get to the function add a contact to training CRM, we know exactly what those lines of code are doing. It simplifies the reading of code, and it allows us to create modules that we can perhaps reuse later on. The add contact to training CRM, for example, could be used in 2 or 3 different automations, and we only need to develop it once. So functions are a powerful way of making code simpler to read and easier to reuse. And we'll see both the use of variables and the use of functions in some of the examples that we're about to walk through. The first concept that we're going to introduce is that of selectors. And selectors is what lets us identify each of the individual objects upon the screen in our physical application, our underlying application that we're going to create automations across. So this is the training CRM. And as we looked at before, there are a variety of different fields on this screen. Each of those fields has a unique selector. So in this example here, we're looking simply at the new button. Now different products will render this information in a slightly different format, and we're going to look at that in the demo in a moment. But in principle, each physical object on the screen has a unique identifier, and it's that unique identifier that we're going to use whenever we create an automation. How this differs from the old screen scraping applications of old is that even when applications change, new fields are added or new functionality created, then the underlying selectors remain the same. Therefore, it means that your automations typically will continue to run even when the application is changed. Now, significant application changes may cause some changes to the selectors, so testing is still important. But on the whole, a minimum amount of rework is ever needed when the underlying application changes. And that's all down to these selectors. These selectors uniquely identify every individual component on the screen or in the browser, and then we can access that information whenever we start to develop our own applications. Now, different solutions address this problem in slightly different ways. So the first step when you start to develop applications will generally be identifying which are the physical objects, i.e. the screen fields, that you're going to be using within your application. And then you're going to create those selectors we mentioned before for each one of those fields so that you can access them within your application. Now, different applications go about this in slightly different ways, and we're going to demonstrate that over the course of a couple of short videos. So the three solutions that we're going to look at are, first of all, Win Automation. Win Automation is a simple desktop solution that uses very clear-cut English language to identify its automation scripts. The second solution we're going to look at is the one provided by NICE. NICE is a more enterprise level solution and captures physical elements in a separate layer, which means multiple teams can work on different components of the same application simultaneously. And then third of all, we're going to look at UiPath. UiPath, as NICE, works both as a desktop and unattended. And UiPath perhaps provides a more integrated approach, a middle ground perhaps between the other two solutions. So it's going to be interesting to see how they address the very first step in your automation journey, which will be capturing the physical objects that you're going to be using within your application. Starting off then with Win Automation, we're going to capture the control for the button New on the contact screen. In our first demo, we're simply going to capture the New button from the training CRM application. So what we have on the screen is the Robot Designer, the tool which Win Automation uses for us to start to develop some of those automations. And I'll give you a quick tour of what this screen is telling us. On the left hand side we have all of the actions. The actions are the instructions that we can use to interface with many of the underlying applications. And as we add each of the instructions, we'll see those building up in the main panel in the middle of the screen. We can use functions and variables within our code to create some reusability, and we'll look at that in a bit more detail later on. And at the bottom of the screen we have our controls repository. Our controls repository is where we're going to store each of the individual physical objects that we're going to need as we go through our application. One of the advantages of process mapping that we will have done before we get to this stage is that we can start to document in detail that level of information that is necessary for us to, when we start automating, simply have it to hand the fields that we're going to need to do the automation. So, step one is we need to make those fields available to Win Automation to use. So we're going to do that first of all by simply selecting the New button. So we're going to add a new control, and we can see Win Automation disappears and allows us to start navigating around the application, the training CRM. You can see here that as we move from field to field, an orange box appears around each of these fields telling us that they're recognized by Win Automation and that we can start to select them to use them within the application. Now, we're just going to use the new button for now, so I'm going to move the cursor over there. Now, though you can't see it, the instruction says I've got to hold down the left control and left click, which I'm going to do now. Having recorded that information, we've gone back into Win Automation, and you can see now the button new exists within our repository, so we can start to reference it and use it within our application. We've also got a little graphic on the right hand side which shows us a representation of what we've done, so we can see what the new button looks like on the screen and help us identify what we need. So I'm going to add another control, because we know when we come into this application, one of the first things we're going to need to do is select on the Contacts tab. So let me go back again, and we navigate our way back to the top of the screen, and we can see that we've got a tab item there called Contacts. And again, I'm going to hold down Control, left click, and we'll see that appear within the application. And so we'll build up all of the physical objects that we require access to within the application.
The second vendor tool we're going to look at is that provided by NICE. NICE is a much more comprehensive development environment. But the principle of selectors works exactly the same way, that we look at the physical objects from the underlying applications and record them. This is an example of the selector as it's shown within the NICE application, and we can see the hierarchy of screen elements, the training application, down to the button. This is the selector that allows us to use and access that information. So let's have a look at how we might capture that using the tool.
Here's our training CRM, and we're going to capture some information from the screen again. This is the NICE application, and we're going to look in a bit more detail at these menu items a little later on, because NICE allows you to separate the different physical and logical layers. However, we're just going to look at the physical objects component at the moment and capture some screen elements to see what that looks like. NICE provides us this little camera icon up here to let us select each of the screen elements. And just like the previous products that we've looked at, NICE highlights the fields as you move over them so that you know which one you're selecting. So we've selected the tabs. I'm going to select another, going into the Contacts tab this time. I'm going to select another to see that build up in the screen over on the left. Right, here's the application. So we've got a couple of items we've selected now. So we've got the main tab control and we've got our edit. And we can see, just like the other application, we've got a bigger graphic now showing us the whole screen. And we can see the specific field there that we've selected. We can also change the name of that field in the same way as we did on the other application. So this was called Salutation. And you may remember we called this Title. It doesn't affect the underlying application. Now NICE provides us with a bit more information that we can take a look at. So if I just expand that a little, we can take a look at the next level of detail. So this was the identification, and again the title field is the combination of the training application through the tab control down to title. That's its selector. But it also shows us some of the functionality. Remember we talked about properties. Here is a list of all of the properties that are available within this object. And we can also see functions and events. So we can see the types of functionality that we can call upon for each object as we create it within the application.
Let's create another one. Again, we can see we've now got our text box, and it's given us the data that was currently in the current text box. Again, let's give it a slightly better name. NICE is actually recording a lot of information about the underlying application, but it's hiding us from it until we need until we need it. But if I click in here and show hidden captures, you can see there's lots more information starting to appear underneath that original capture. For example, it identified the individual contacts tab, which is something that we're going to need later on. So I'm going to make that visible. Okay. Keeping all of your screen elements in a nice hierarchical structure makes it nice and easy to access. And they can be expanded and collapsed when you're using them within the application, which is also a very convenient functionality. We're going to come back and visit the NICE interface a little later on. But for now, it's worth noting that once you capture all of the screen elements for an application, you can store those screen elements in a separate module and reuse them many times in many different applications. So although it takes a lot more effort in terms of setting up and defining the structures to be able to use the application, the opportunity for reuse later on is huge, and this will save vast amounts of time in the long run.
Our third look at selectors is going to be using the UiPath tool. I'm less familiar with UiPath than the other tools we've looked at today, but it provides some interesting insights in terms of providing the flexibility that we've seen from Win Automation with some of the power that we've also seen from NICE in a much neater package.
This is the UiPath interface. We're just going to look at selectors, but a quick look around the interface shows us the types of actions we can perform, an area for us to drop activities and build our activities. We'll see variables and arguments at the bottom of the screen, and then properties that are relevant to whatever we're doing on the right hand side, and the play button to run the automation. UiPath provides us with a tool called UI Explorer, which lets us interrogate and look at the selectors for different applications. I've already started the training CRM, and we can see that that's visible within the Explorer. If I open up the training database and then select a target element, then I get the same type of functionality we've seen before, the ability to scroll over items on the screen and see the objects highlighted as UiPath recognizes what they are. So if we look at the Contacts tab, for instance, I'll click there and it'll bring us back and show us the selector for the Contacts tab. UiPath, again, works in the same way as many other robotic process automation tools, in the fact that by using selectors, it is able to be fairly robust when it comes to changes to the underlying applications. We'll look at a demo using UiPath a little later on.